to Prolespod.
Welcome to part 5 of the Stalin Eras, our much anticipated criticism and contradictions episode. This is your faithful host, Ray. As noted during the introduction episode, the aim of this series was not to produce a hagiography or 25 hours of uncritical Stalin glazing. Throughout the series, we've already highlighted shortcomings of both Stalin and the USSR. That said, we devoted an entire episode to addressing legitimate and not so legitimate criticisms and examining some contradictions, some of which were submitted by our wonderful patrons on Patreon, which you, yes, you, can join at patreon.com/Prolespod to get access to some swell bonus content. Also, make sure to follow us on our socials at Prolespod on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and proles.pod on TikTok. This episode is not going to be exhausted refutations or explanations of each matter we address. Obviously, we could literally do an entire episode for each of these topics. For the sake of our sanity, we've opted to present a baseline or introduction for addressing, accepting, understanding, and wrestling with these critiques and contradictions. The topics we will be covering are as follows: anti-homosexuality laws, anti-abortion laws introduced in the 1930s, Stalin's misreading of class struggle in the 1930s, the Gulag, Stalin's failure to adequately prepare the Soviet Union for succession, and delving into somewhat ominously named final contradiction. This will be a packed and whirlwind episode that we hope will prove useful to MLs and socialists of all stripes. So even if you have a comrade who hasn't been following the Stalin eras, we hope this will be worth sharing with them. So, who do we have with us today?
I'm Jeremy.
I'm Justin.
And we got Tony.
Please note that interspersed between our discussions of different contradictions and criticisms, we will be quoting Stalin on the value of self-criticism at length. So, one of the most common criticisms that we received, both from our patrons as well as from people on our social media, as well as obviously just like ambient Stalin criticism writ large, is that Stalin hated the gays. What do you think about that?
And he might have, but that's sort of beside the point. So this is the criticism here is related to the anti-gay legislation that was passed not just at the level of the USSR, but also within each individual Soviet state, each republic. Most of them had some individual anti-gay legislation that was passed around this time. And there were reasons for that, which I'm going to get into, but I wanted to sort of establish a foundation of what the history of homosexuality was within the Tsarist Empire. So preceding the RSFSR and preceding the Soviet Union, because there is a foundation upon which all of this is built. You can't escape history, I suppose, is the point here. So Simon Karlinski wrote Hidden from History in 1989. He said, quote, "There is a considerable body of evidence that prior to the westernizing reforms of Peter the Great at the beginning of the 18th century, male homosexuality was widespread and tolerated in all strata of Russian society. This is attested by foreign travelers and also by the sermons and denunciations by Russian Orthodox churchmen of the 16th and 17th centuries who repeatedly complained about the prevalence of homosexuality." End quote. So obviously the West had an impact on what was, it seems like, a fairly commonplace practice of homosexuality within the Russian Empire. There were multiple words in the Russian language for women who took on the appearance and actions of men, none of which were derogatory. They were almost like it was cool if a woman was tough and manly, but...
Or tomboy.
Yeah, and then in the inverse, there were multiple...
Adult.
Tom Adult. there were multiple words for men who took on a feminine aspect, some of which were derogatory. So already, even though, again, homosexuality was practiced quite widely, there was already sort of a foundation of anti-male homosexuality, even within that context. However, sex between men was quite common in feudal Russia prior to the 18th century. Even Peter the Great was said to have participated in bisexual relationships. There was a form of there was a form of what we would now call coercive homosexuality between the aristocracy and or landowners and laborers, which was so common that it had a name, gentleman's mischief. It was like so widespread they had a name for it. But in the early 18th century, as capitalism began to take hold across Europe, Peter the Great decided that he wanted to modernize and westernize the Russian Empire, and he hired a group of German military advisors to begin that process within the Russian military. They drafted a military code which included a provision for sentencing homosexuals to be burned at the stake if they were caught. In 1832, Tsar Nicholas I expanded this criminalization to include all Russian citizens, no longer burning them at the stake, but it was basically an expansion of that existing law, which began in the military. So it was over 100 years later, in fairly recent history, that it became illegal to be gay in the Russian Empire. By the mid to late 19th century, capitalism and industrialization had pulled many peasants away from the countryside. Mostly these were men, and capitalist relations kind of defined homosexual relationships during this period as bathhouses, gay bars, and try not to laugh at this one. They had balls for women haters, which allowed gay men to associate discreetly. Like dancing balls for women haters.
Dancing balls, everybody.
Yeah,
you heard it here
balls.
first.
You heard it here first. So a lot of people give credit to the Bolsheviks, and obviously they should to some degree, for legalizing homosexuality, but that wasn't really the intent. It's just that the Tsarist code of laws was abolished shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, and that de facto opened the door for more overt expressions of homosexuality and transness. In fact, in 1922, a trans man married a cis woman, and when the trans man was outed, charges were filed against the couple, basically in an attempt to declare the marriage illegal. But the court found that due to the fact that both parties consented, as in like the trans man did not trick this cis woman into it, they allowed the marriage to go forward, which also, again, sort of de facto legalized gay marriage within the RSFSR. Although whether that translated to gay marriages actually happening, I don't know. There's not any data on this. It's just that this, this was something that I found in Sherry Wolf's Sexuality and Socialism, which is I honestly can't recommend most of these books that I read for this section because they were so deeply anti-communist. But, she held this up as like, oh, they legalized gay marriage. And then I looked into it and I was like, well, not really. It just like this one incident occurred and we don't have any other information. But in 1929, so this is where things begin to shift. By the late 20s already, there begins to be sort of this current against the liberalization that had occurred following the Bolshevik Revolution. So in 1929, the Expert Medical Council of the Commissariat of Health held a conference to discuss homosexuality, intersex, and transness. There was no consensus reached. There were varied opinions that ranged from very progressive to extremely regressive. However, there were some sort of positive things that happened here. Clinical psychiatrist P.B. Ganushkin reported that he was consistently asked about the viability and availability of gender-affirming operations by his patients, and then sort of expressing an opinion that was decades ahead of his time, biologist N.K. Koltsov stated, quote, "Of course, there is no intermediate sex, but rather an infinite quantity of intermediate sexes," end quote.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. A large contingent of scientists advocated for the rights of, quote, masculine women perceived to be lesbian, who were seen as a benefit to the proletarian struggle and to the ranks of the Red Army. They saw them as a biologically based group, as in they were not. This was not a cultural thing. This was not a degeneracy thing. This is just a natural thing that some women just like to be like men or behave in masculine ways. However, effeminate men who were viewed as being gay were largely seen as dangerous and a hindrance. That was the majority opinion from amongst the people who were present at this conference. Yeah, I mean, we'll get to sort of what's happening here, but beginning in 1930, there were these two schools of thoughts that were kind of fighting for dominance regarding how to view homosexuality and gender variance. And it sort of is demonstrated in the fact that the first edition of the 1930 Great Soviet Encyclopedia includes references to Hirschfeld, the German scientist who had done a lot of studies on sexuality and gender in Germany under the Weimar Republic. When the Nazis burned books, a lot of what they were burning was Hirschfeld's research. But anyway, they included references to Hirschfeld's endocrinological explanation for homosexuality, and it celebrates his struggle for gay emancipation, which allowed the integration of alienated homosexuals into the collective. However, by the second edition of the 1930 encyclopedia, that positive language had been removed, and the editors were denouncing homosexuality as a feature of capitalist society, and that it would not be something that's present in a true socialist society. But I'm going to include a few quotes here, some of which you've probably heard. But, Karl Marx wrote, "People make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under the circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past." And then from Lenin, we have, "Not a single democratic party in the world, not even the most advanced bourgeois republic, had done in decades so much as 100th part of what we did in our first year in power. We actually razed to the ground the infamous laws placing women in a position of inequality, restricting divorce and surrounding it with disgusting formalities, denying recognition to children born out of wedlock, enforcing a search for their fathers, etc. Laws, numerous survivals of which, to the shame of the bourgeoisie and of capitalism, are to be found in all civilized countries. Notwithstanding all the liberating laws that have been passed, woman continues to be a domestic slave because petty housework crushes, strangles, stultifies, and degrades her, chains her to the kitchen and to the nursery, and wastes her labor on barbarously unproductive, petty, nerve-wracking, stultifying, and crushing drudgery. The real emancipation of women will begin only when the mass struggle is started against the petty domestic economy, or rather, when it is transformed on a mass scale into a large-scale socialist economy." And he's speaking here about women, but I think the same thing applies to a variety of social concerns. There is a tendency to view these laws and these policies as devoid of any kind of context and separated from the world that it was built in. And unfortunately, because following the establishment of the Soviet Union, there was not a worldwide communist revolution. They could not advance as far or as quickly as they wanted to. They had to turn inward and develop socialism in one country, more or less, because there was no opportunity for them to economically develop with the help of the rest of the world. In fact, they were antagonized by the rest of the world. And so there were concerns, economic concerns, major economic concerns that they had to address. And we will get to this in the next section even more so. There were underlying base level reasons for the ban on homosexuality. It was not just because they hated gay people. But, again, here's another quote from Workers' World Party founder Sam Marcy. He wrote that the Soviet Union, quote, had thrust upon it 3 Herculean tasks utterly unprecedented in the entire history of the class struggle. It had the duty and obligation to reorganize on a revolutionary basis the left wing of the social democratic movement, put it on a communist basis, and lay the foundation for a new and revolutionary international. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were thus obligated from the start not only to give revolutionary leadership at home, but, in a way, to become the general staff of the world revolution, which seemed visible on the horizon, especially in Western Europe and later in the East in China. Its second task, no less urgent and intimately connected with it, was for the new worker state to defend itself against the most barbaric assaults by the united front of the imperialists from Vladivostok to Murmansk. And thirdly, it had to begin to lay socialist economic foundations and raise the living standards of the workers and peasants who had passed through a most horrible period of destruction, civil war, and famine. And that's kind of the crux of it, is that the RSFSR and the Soviet Union had to deal with the invasion by Western powers during the so-called Civil War. They had to deal with the Volga famine. They had to deal with the rise of fascism in the West, and as a result needed to rapidly industrialize. And these factors are, when we recorded the Stalin episode with RevLeft, we list some of the possible factors that led to the passage of Article 121, but they weren't terribly materialist, right? They were just oh, well, there may have been this guy whose son was gay and he was embarrassing his father, and so he was the one who pushed for this bill to be passed, or, but why did it pass? Why did the governing bodies of the various republics and the Soviet Union pass these laws if it was just one guy who wanted it? That doesn't make any sense. But anyway, Leslie Feinberg is the only author in this batch of people that I had to read that I can recommend. She wrote Lavender and Red, which has a whole very materialist analysis of the history of homosexuality and how it relates to the socialist struggle. But she writes, any study of how and why important political rights that had been won for same-sex love and women were reversed in the Soviet Union in the 1930s has to take into consideration the effects that encirclement, economic embargo, and isolation, sabotage, civil war, and other weapons of unrelenting attack by world capitalism had on this vast but economically underdeveloped country. Stripping historical reality from these steps backward does historic injustice to the tens of millions of workers and peasants of many nationalities, sexes, genders, and sexualities who built the revolution with their sweat and defended it against the onslaught of world imperialism with their blood. And it merely fans the flames of anti-communism, serving to derail the forward motion of the planet's working class and oppressed people toward genuine liberation. An honest look at the measures taken against male homosexuality and abortion, which Ray will get to, in the 1930s Soviet Union must ask, what effect did the low level of the productive apparatus and the high level of scarcity and deprivation have on the political goals of the Bolshevik Party? How did this frustrate the early goals of achieving the liberation of women and greater freedom of sexuality from state regulation? So we have to look at what was happening alongside the criminalization of male homosexuality. We can't just view it as an isolated data point. It didn't happen in a vacuum. Is it a good thing? Was the ban on male homosexuality good? No. Was it defensible? No. But as Feinberg says, it is not inexplicable. Crisis after crisis after crisis, invasion, civil war, famine, the rise of fascism, the Soviet Union faced a deficit of laborers and military personnel. And the first thing that they did was not to ban abortion or criminalize homosexuality. The first thing that they did was to create the conditions necessary for women to enter the workforce en masse, for women to join the military. Then, after they created those conditions, they created a series of campaigns advocating for women to join the military and the labor pool. During the first 5-year plan, it's estimated that 82% of new workers joining the proletariat were women. But this created a contradiction. The birth rate began to drop rapidly. But on top of that, rumors of homosexuals in prominent roles within the Nazi Party began to circulate through the Soviet Union in 1931 and 1932. Maxim Gorky famously wrote, quote, "Destroy homosexuality and fascism will disappear," end quote. we're going to get into, it's not necessarily speculation, but I'm going to say allegedly here, and I'll explain why. But it was our good friend Yagoda, who first proposed the criminalization of male homosexuality in 1933, allegedly. He allegedly wrote to Stalin that homosexual men had developed, quote, networks of salons, centers, dens, groups, and other organized formations of pederasts, with the eventual transformation of these organizations into outright espionage cells, pederast activities, using the caste-like exclusivity of pederastic circles for plainly counter-revolutionary aims, had politically demoralized various social layers of young men, including young workers, and even attempted to penetrate the army and navy. Stalin then allegedly forwarded this letter to Kaganovich with the note, quote, these scoundrels must receive exemplary punishment, and corresponding guiding decree must be introduced in our legislation. So the reason I say allegedly is that we have not been able to get a hold of the primary source document or documents upon which these quotes are based. There is only one source for them, and it's Dan Healy, who is a rabid anti-communist. That doesn't mean that it's not true. It may very well be true. We have been trying to find the document, and if we do, we will post it. We do know that there was an English communist who was living in the Soviet Union, but left and went back to England, who wrote Stalin a rather scathing letter about the application of Article 121. And Stalin wrote in the margin something like, a degenerate and a coward, and did not write him back. Very rare for Stalin. But that probably means that somewhere within Stalin was homophobia. I don't think that that's like an unjust accusation, but he was not the one who did this. You know, he may have suggested that this is a thing that should happen, but it was not him who passed the law. But the Soviet Union was actually not the first to pass an anti-male homosexuality law. It was our good friends in the Ukrainian SSR in January 1934. And then in March of 1934, Article 121 is passed with no explanation and no release of information to the public. There was a case study done of Moscow men who were prosecuted under Article 121 between 1935 and 1941. And of the individuals who were prosecuted in 1935, only one was even aware that it was a crime because they didn't disseminate this information to the public. Now, there was an individual in 2020, Vladimir Volodsin, who did a study of prosecution against men under Article 121, beginning in 1946 and ending in 1991. And unfortunately, there is no reliable data before that. And unfortunately, he does not include convictions. And I do have to wonder if that's because very few people were actually convicted under this law. But he does include a lot of helpful numbers, which we can now kind of examine and see when the peak of prosecutions were and how many people were being prosecuted under the law. So as with many regulations and laws in the Soviet Union, the attitude of the overseeing official in any given locality was kind of the deciding factor in how often the anti-gay legislation in one SSR or another was invoked. There were also two categories. Category 1 was sort of consensual homosexual relationship, and Category 2 was non-consensual, so rape or sexual assault, more or less. The author of the paper said that he doesn't give any justification for how he arrived at this, but he says that the prosecutions appeared to be more or less 50-50, but he said it was his own estimation and not an actual like verifiable number, which I don't know. We again don't have any reliable data before 1946. However, it was not under Stalin which convictions were at their highest. In fact, they were relatively low in the late 40s and the early 50s. They began to spike in 1957 under Bulganin, and then again under Brezhnev. There was an upward trend in prosecutions and convictions all the way through the beginning of Perestroika, and they did not fall as quickly as you might imagine given young Gorby's sort of liberalizing reforms. Although lesbianism was never formally illegal under Soviet law, gay women were persecuted at various times, though with much less frequency and almost exclusively for Category 2 offenses. Where women were arrested for consensual homosexual relationships, they were almost never charged, and if they were virtually never convicted. However, women were quite often subject to mandatory psychotherapy for what they refer to as sapphic behaviors. Okay, so the actual numbers. For the years in which Stalin was alive, in 1946, 82 people were prosecuted. In 1947, 63. In 1948, 64. In 1949, 144. 1950, 190. 1951, 187. 1952, 251. 1953, 187. And these numbers sort of steadily increase through 1956. But as I mentioned, in 1957, prosecutions jumped to 686 from 295 the year before. In 1959, we have 764. This falls to 439 in 1960. We don't break into quadruple digits until 1970, which is 1,223. The peak during this period was 1,355 in 1974. We don't exceed that number until 1983, when the number prosecuted hits 1,440. The peak in the 1980s is in 1985, with 1,620 prosecutions. The numbers fall steadily by like 100 to a few hundred, finally landing at 343 prosecutions in 1991. So the least number of prosecutions as a proportion of the overall population of the USSR after Stalin was 0.00012% of the population of the USSR. This was equal to the percentage in 1954, the year after Stalin died. Under Stalin, the worst year amounted to 0.00013% of the population. So we're talking about 1/100,000th of a percentage point more under the highest proportion under Stalin. But he did not oversee the worst application of this law. Again, that would have been, it would have been at various points slightly higher, but even still, we're not talking about like mass repression. Like, we're not talking about like millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people. It is indefensible, but it is also not, I don't know what to say. Like, we're talking about double digits through most of the 1940s. Of people who were prosecuted under this law. And again, we don't know how many were convicted. It may have been none. It may have been 2 people. It may have been 10. And I also understand that like that's not the end of it, because just having a law like this on the books means that people are afraid to come out and be themselves in public around other people. They don't feel safe. And that's really fucking shitty. But I don't know what to say. What are y'all's thoughts?
I think that we see this as a theme throughout this time, and something that I want to reiterate, that to quote myself from a previous episode, that it's really easy to want to compare things to like what they could have and should have been, rather than comparing them to what they were previously. And the Soviet Union obviously like does not arise out of a vacuum. It arises from its unique material conditions that include Tsarist Russia and a lot of countries that were, to use like their own language, socially very backward, and they're grappling and fumbling really clumsily and like wrongly, obviously. If anyone's like, I thought it was fine, I don't think it's fine, to try to figure out how to eradicate this. And like, we're going to talk about this more, obviously, as I start talking about abortion, but we see like an obvious parallel here where it's like the Bolsheviks really understand what to do in, for example, war times, and how to handle things militarily, and how to handle things in like certain other domains. But when it comes to trying to find a way to like legislate certain aspects of social relations and human behavior, it's it, it's just a bridge that like can't be crossed.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And like, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to like step on your section, so I'm not going to get too much into the
Step on my section. Step on my section, baby.
But the motivation was almost certainly a fear of underpopulation, not having enough workers, not having enough soldiers. The same shit with the fucking abortion law, right? Like it's not good and it's not defensible, but again, it's not inexplicable.
Right.
And it sucks.
I also wonder, I find this interesting. I'm really sorry, because it's like people were criminalized, their behavior was criminalized. And like, it's just where my sort of my brain goes. I'm not trying to trivialize this, but I feel a lot of curiosity, and I kind of tried to look into it. But again, this is just not the aperture through which the Soviets are conceptualizing of things at this time. So it's really hard to understand where it's coming from. But we can also see here, just like a lot of it, it's hard for me to get a foothold into, in terms of even the question when we're talking about people being who they are. I mean, the shift from identifying as a homosexual, for example, rather than the criminalization, even when we're talking about criminalizing homosexuality, I'm sort of like, we're criminalizing acts, right? Not people's identities. And so like, even within this, I'm still trying to understand, like, there's clearly a difference, for example, between gay men and gay women. This is like throughout history that predates the USSR. I'm trying to understand, like, what is illegal? Is it like PDA? Is it private butt stuff? And then there's also a general part of why it's challenging to get this information. And I've heard like many people who grew up in the Soviet Union, as well as Soviet historians, speaking about this, where it's like, on one hand, especially during this period, they're really trying to, I don't want to say control, but they are not control individuals, but they're trying to like control the direction of Soviet life and social relations to like build the model of the new Soviet. And also, as a point of reference, as a point of their priorities, they're not particularly interested in like getting up into people's business. And so you can see, as we're trying to unpack this, it's like, it's really challenging to see where these lines are. And it's clear that they don't know. And I'm not trying to be like, oh, a bumbling empire, the way that they like so often do toward the United States or something like obviously in this case, even the Soviet state, even the burgeoning Soviet state has more power than any one Soviet individual, right? So there's clearly like a power imbalance, but it is also like, they're just like trying to figure things out. And I don't really know how much they know. And at least with abortion, they could consult women. Now, obviously, what it is to be a Soviet woman, like, this is not one singular thing. But when it comes to homosexuality, especially if you're coming from already a culture that is intensely homophobic and has a history of intermittently criminalizing homophobia, criminalizing your behavior, assuming that you're some kind of pedophile or something, all of these like really crazy things, it's really challenging, I would imagine, for the Soviets to even have like gay people to help them weigh in on things and to help them like understand things. And so we see it also with abortion, that actually, and I'll get into it, like, the framing of the question is wrong. And so the solutions are wrong. And this is the same thing that happens here. They're asking the wrong question, and therefore they can only produce incorrect answers. But at the same time, I don't really know how many people were like, I'm a gay Soviet, I'll help you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, the fact that like men who were prosecuted in 1935 didn't know it was against the law means that they were either already being secretive because they were worried about social stigma, or they were being open about it and nobody gave a fuck. Except, again, like, it depends on whatever local commissar or regional like person was in charge at the time who decided we're going to prosecute or we're not going to prosecute.
Do you remember, if you can remember this far back, because it feels like we were physically there and we lived it, Jeremy, when we did the discussion for Section 1, and when they're trying to navigate things with the peasants, they kind of like put laws in place, but really they didn't have a full understanding of the different social relations within the peasant like classes. And as a result, just local peasants were kind of using these guidelines as a way to be like, we fucking hate that guy. Let's get him and get his tractor. So they're like, no, he is actually like a rich, you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
they're given these guidelines and then they're left to interpret them in their own like municipalities, like in their own. And it kind of reminded me of this is like, who was this used against? They're probably just like, I hate that fucking guy. Let's say he's gay.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Yeah. But again, and I wish we had numbers of convictions, because I would be willing to bet it's extremely fucking low. I would be willing to bet that. I mean, category 2 probably more so heavy conviction rates than category
Right.
1.
And I'm
but
still unclear, like what's illegal, like, cause you could be
Yeah.
like, I'm sorry. I'm feeling really like, I'm just feeling jaunty in my spirit today. I'm so sorry. We can edit all of this out. I feel like everybody's coming with a very different tone and I'm really somewhere else today. But I'm just like, what is like you look girly or like prove you didn't do the butt stuff? Like how do you?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is homosexual actions.
How do you prove
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
but what, do you know what I mean? Like, what is that? Like much of the
Yeah.
world, you hold hands with your friends or
Yeah.
you know, they were kissing on the lips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As friends. So I'm like, what are you doing in public that is like,
Well, they went to balls of women haters.
like, how would you prove it? Well,
Criticism by a counter-revolutionary is also criticism, but its object is to discredit the Soviet regime, to undermine our industry, to disrupt our party work. Obviously, it is not such criticism we have in mind. What do we expect primarily from the slogan of self-criticism? What results can it yield if it's carried out properly and honestly? It should yield at least 2 results. It should, in the first place, sharpen the vigilance of the working class, make it pay more attention to our shortcomings, facilitate their correction, and render impossible any kind of surprises in our constructive work. It should, in the second place, improve the political culture of the working class, develop it in the feeling that it's the master of the country, and facilitate the training of the working class in the work of administering the country.
so very similar to the critique of the criminalization of homosexual activity, we got a ton of requests to discuss the outlawing of abortions, which because of woke, I will speak about. I mentioned it a little bit in the part 4 discussion, but I think that there is more to say. So let's, get into it. As I've already said before, it goes without saying, I support abortion. I love abortion for any reason anyone who's pregnant might have. Yay, abortion. So to be clear, that's my stance. And there is so much nuance and context, very similar to what Jeremy was saying, that I have to unpack before you all can understand what this law meant, who opposed it, why they opposed it, because we're looking at 2 hugely different sets of material conditions. So after some of the most progressive family laws in the world, the USSR being the first country to legalize abortion, outlined in the family codes during the 20s, which you can hear about in our discussion that I referenced earlier. On June 27th, 1936, the Central Committee decides to ban abortion. About a month before that, on May 26th, they released a draft of the law for open discussion. In some of the USSR, especially some of the more rural areas, it's not particularly controversial. Not to say that everyone was happy with it, but the loudest objections are coming from young urban women. And the objections have nothing to do with this sort of like, not to disparage this slogan, but it's not coming from a place of like my body, my choice, or most of the arguments that would be legible to a Western person interested in like a pro-life discourse. So I'll talk about that a little bit. So this is like a generation of like well-educated, proud Soviet women, and they're excited to finally have like an equal opportunity in the job market. It's not that they didn't want kids, because I think like culturally at this point, motherhood is still a widespread norm. It's pretty much assumed. And like most people are fine with that. Most people want kids. But they were really stressed because especially in the cities, there weren't enough options for balancing childcare and work. And also there just wasn't enough space in their homes. So partly, I also want to say, I feel like if we were thinking about it now, if God bless us, the Soviet Union still existed, we're talking about like office jobs that you would have like in a city, I think they probably just like bring their kids to work and it would be fine. But again, we're talking about the 30s, and this is a largely industrializing time, a rapidly industrializing time. So we're looking at like factory work, medical work, engineering projects, like stuff that's not like safe or easy to bring a baby to, right? And also culturally, even though housework and childcare was supposed to be shared, right? The Soviet Union is like sending out these messages about sharing the child caring and democratizing the home and things like that. First, I mean, we just talked about the Soviet Union does not pop up out of nowhere. It arises from very specific material conditions, which is like centuries of patriarchy, right? So the men are just not habituated to it yet. Even the ones who probably like think very positively about women, who feel very strongly that women are equals, who are totally fine with all of this, are just not habituated to doing this work. And second, there's just certain biological realities of having a baby that are just not split evenly, right? So I looked it up, by the way, and like technically formula, like infant formula, it exists in the world, but it's not widely available in the Soviet Union until literally the 1970s, right? So there's just certain things that are going to take more time for the mother than for any other member of the family. Up to this point, I think this probably feels pretty familiar to most of us, right? The argument's a little bit different, but like the demand on your time, your body, your career, your home, like all of this feels really similar, right? I also want to just lay out, especially because a lot of people, specifically in the United States, but not limited to that, are experiencing, some pretty damaging legal ramifications of abortion. When we're saying illegal, I want to clarify exactly what that means. So the person giving the abortion would be incarcerated or could be incarcerated for up to 3 years. The person receiving the abortion would face a fine. If you coerced a person into having an abortion, you could face 2 years in prison. So just to be clear what we're talking about. And the second line of the thing that they published, the law that they published, it says like very clearly, if any pregnancy was a medical risk, abortion was legal at any time. This was like not a question. Also, again, this is 1936. So like, yes, we've discussed the USSR's need for more people, but this is not the only reason. I would say it's the lion's share, it's the majority reason, but also this isn't a law that's rooted in hating women or wanting to control women, even if it does sort of give that and have that effect. And I think that that's very understandable. But this was like a genuine concern for safety because the abortion procedure was not as safe or as healthy as it is now, nor was it necessarily as effective. That said, this was, a pretty significant error in judgment because after just a couple of years of this law passing, the birth rates went back to normal, which is to say they had fallen again. However, the deaths of people seeking illegal abortions went way, way, way up. So it turns out, obviously, an illegal abortion was even more dangerous and detrimental to one's health, even fatal than the original legal procedure. 2 years after Stalin's death, abortion becomes legal again. So, like, this is dark, especially because early on in the Soviet experiment, the West sort of accuses the USSR of nationalizing women. And honestly, being forced to have a baby that you don't want to have just because you owe it to the country, it's not exactly nationalizing women because you're choosing with whom you have that baby, but it's a relationship to the state that I don't think, any of us would be comfortable with, even if that state won for us a revolution, right? All that to say, while this piece of legislation is understandably known for the abortion bit, there's more to it than that. A little quote here, by the way, from the People's Commissar of Justice of the RSFSR, admirably expressing this in the following words. It would be a mistake to think that the chief features of the draft of the law consist only in the fact that it prohibits abortions. The draft represents a whole system of measures directed toward a single aim. The aim of protecting the health of more than half of the population of the USSR, that is to say, women, and of bringing up a strong and healthy generation of future citizens, people who will continue and complete the great work of building socialism begun by us. So during the same time, in the same moment, the same pieces of paper, the USSR is also committing to increasing aid to mothers and those with larger families, and in many instances, even like doubling the amount of aid that they receive. They made it illegal to discriminate against the hiring of women who were pregnant or already mothers, as well as giving them 6 months of wages and transferring the mother to like lighter work, whatever this means during that time. They prioritized creating more maternity houses, like maternity wards, like more beds and stuff like that, training more people to deliver babies, and especially making sure that more of them were like out in the rural areas where there weren't as many hospitals and where people were still acculturated and expecting to have home births. They were like, fine, we'll train people to like help you at your home. They planned to expand nurseries, kitchens, kindergartens. And they did a lot to like target where those would be most effective for people. They made playgrounds on collective farms and like allocated a pretty significant budget to all of these projects, as well as the jobs that were created for all these people to do these things. They also increased the penalty for anyone not paying alimony. And in fact, you could go to jail for a few years if you were caught not paying alimony. All these things are obviously good. They're great. And they're not comprehensive, which kind of sets me up for this because I want to talk about the broader implications of criminalizing abortion outside of the argument that we would probably consider to be like the feminist argument or the argument that we see often in the West. So Lenin writes often, and obviously Stalin summarized this in Foundations of Leninism. If you remember that far back, we did a whole episode about it, about the relationship of the party to the masses. The party is supposed to be the most highly organized, highly conscious manifestation of the needs of the people. And this requires like careful consideration and analysis, not just of their material conditions, but also, like I was kind of saying early with Jeremy's criticism, their felt experiences. So there's like a lot of talk and a lot of writing in a revolutionary context about like not being ahead of the people, not being behind the people. But in this case, it fails because they just misdiagnosed the problem. In general, a lot of what's written is like the assumption is people don't want to have babies because they're too poor. They feel like they're stretched too thin, they're just too poor, and that's why they can't have babies. So they diagnose this as the problem. They're like, oh, well, gee, then the solution is just that we like make it easier. We further subsidize what it is to have a child. We make it easier for families. We make it easier for mothers. But that's just not the whole problem. So we see this a lot. I'm pretty sure that I'm quoting Samantha Loam, Stalin's Constitution. She wrote Stalin's Constitution. Is that correct? Is that the author? Okay, thank you. Because I actually didn't write this in my notes. It's just like something that I'm channeling her spirit in this moment. She's alive. I'm not channeling her spirit. But she talked, I've heard her, I believe, in an interview before, talking about the way that people, as much as people want to talk about like mind control and whatever, people learned how to speak in a way that the party would understand, that would be legible to the party. Shock and awe, everybody. That's the fucking social contract, right? Like when you hear corporate speak, well, we're talking about circling back, it's the same thing, right? So even if the party is trying to elicit information, like the pamphlet that I'm drawing this information from was like sent around to everybody and everybody was just allowed to like write in, and many of them did. But it's common that they're going to write things in a way that makes them sound like good, upstanding citizens, which is not to say that they weren't. It's just like, this is how things are done. Like, this is culture, right? And so if you think that that's not true, think about how you talk at the bank, think about how you talk at immigration, think about how you talk in these different situations. Like, we all do that. That is what social contract is. And so I think that even if they were looking for information, one, maybe the people that they were asking really just genuinely were having a different lived experience, as well as maybe the people that they were asking and eliciting information from were going to frame it in a very specific way. And so they knew, because the USSR is invested in building this new economic system, that they could probably make an economic argument for why they wouldn't want to have children. And this isn't scholarship, by the way, like I'm just speculating about this, but it's probably like, some people just don't want to have kids. Or even if they make it easy for divorce, even if they make it easy for alimony, the reality of what it is to be, for example, in an abusive relationship, or to be in a relationship that's just like kind of so toxic and hard to leave. It's just sort of like, just because you have an out, just because you have opportunities doesn't mean that you're going to take them.
Or you
just
might be very young,
technically,
right? Like you
absolutely.
may not want to have a child when you're 18 or something, and you yeah. I mean, there's lots and lots of reasons.
And a lot of the people who didn't want to do it, like similar, like we see now, most of them were mothers. A lot of them had 3, 4, 5 kids already.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really know how to resolve it other than I think that the Soviets we see this a lot. Like their downfall was their genuine commitment and belief in their ideology and their ideological project. And they're like, men and women are equal, so they are equal. When the reality is probably what would have just made the difference. This is my opinion, but like if they're doing, I know the 40-hour work week is a more recent development, but let's say they're having a 40-hour week. It's like, well, we just pay women the same and they do 25-hour weeks. And then we understand that they're doing other responsibilities at home. And that's just like, is what it is.
Yeah. If you were to go to a debate in the West at some university about the merits of abortion versus not, you're probably not going to encounter any argument for abortion that doesn't involve something that the Soviets addressed in their banning of abortion, right? It is that, mothers are too young, how are you supposed to have a career, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and so like while I am with Ray, I think that if you want an abortion, you should be able to have an abortion, period, right? Just to preserve your own body, if nothing else.
And whether or not either of us thinks that, the reality of humanity bears out that if you criminalize abortion, people get abortions.
Right.
So that is just a truth of the human condition.
And these are things that they were wrestling with at the time. And I think, given enough time, regardless of Stalin's death or not, right, they would have figured it out.
That said, I think that we're so abused and battered by our social contracts, respectively, that, I don't want to make I'm sure that if I was like a single mother and I was like living in a studio, like I would want a bigger place and I would want the right to have a bigger place and I would want not to have to come home and do all of the domestic labor and nurse my child, and I want to like have access to all of the food that I like and all that. Like they should rightfully want to like ask for more. And by the way, like every revolutionary in history has understood this and really genuinely cared about it. It's just, again, like, yes, we're all just sort of like, yay, abortion. And also the choices that they were making and the reasons for making those choices were just very different than our context. And I just think that it's important that we accurately assess that. It's still the wrong choice, and it's wrong for maybe different reasons than we would think that it's wrong. And when I was talking about being in front of or behind the party, if you're the one who's pregnant now, today, having a baby right after abortion has become illegal, and maybe all of those nurseries aren't there and you're still waiting for your subsidy, and your boss is like, I don't give a fuck, and isn't following the law, and there's really nobody to enforce it, right? Like these things take time. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about the legislation being ahead of the party. And in some ways, the family codes were ahead of the consciousness of the masses, not in all ways, but as I said, with the domestic labor and understandings of even what a childhood is, like all of these concepts are about 15 years old at the time that this is all happening. There are ways in which, the Soviets' ideals are in front of their material reality. Then they have to pull it back with the family codes that are happening later, like the one in 26, for example. And then by 10 years later, they're like having to walk it back. They're trying to do everything that they can. But like, again, it's just like they really understood something about certain elements of statecraft. And in other ways, as people who were the first to do it, they really don't understand. And I think that it's not about understanding so much as like there's always going to be a tension and something that is lost and something that does not translate when we are trying to make legislation, like statewide legislation about things that are related to human relationships. And like, we can see this right there. Like, that's not materialism, right? Because again, as I've said many times, the whole thing about materialism is you have to weigh it on each case-by-case basis every single time. And so anything that's kind of like a sweeping law or something like that, if it has to do with human relationships, there's going to be people that are left out. There's going to be people that are put into situations that I'm sure the state wouldn't have wanted them to be in, and that they themselves wouldn't have wanted to be in. And so again, yes, it's just black and white. It's clear. Meddling with people's abortions is just not a good idea. It's medical care that people should have access to for any reason. And I actually think that the critique here is about a relationship of the state and the party first being ahead of the people and then lagging behind the needs of the people. And like, that is the criticism I think that is like worth our time and attention.
Yeah. The demand is often made that criticism should be correct on all accounts, and if it is not correct on every point, they begin to decry and disparage it. That is wrong, comrades. It is a dangerous misconception. Only try to put forward such a demand, and you will gag hundreds of thousands of workers correspondents, and village correspondents who desire to correct our shortcomings, but who sometimes are unable to formulate their ideas correctly. We would get not self-criticism, but the silence of the tomb. You must know that workers are sometimes afraid to tell the truth about shortcomings in our work. They are afraid not only because they might get into hot water for it, but also because they might be made into a laughingstock on account of their imperfect criticism. How can you expect an ordinary worker or an ordinary peasant with his own painful experience in shortcomings in our work and in our planning to frame his criticisms according to all the rules of the art? If you demand that their self-criticism should be 100% correct, you will be killing all possibility of criticism from below, all possibility of self-criticism.
So, as we were discussing, the Soviets are trying to reimagine all manner of social relations. And one of those includes the question of carcerality, re-education, and of course, the Gulag.
Yes, thanks for that intro, Ray. I am actually here. I was just meditating in preparation for my part.
Which has actually scientifically been proven to increase happiness in individuals.
Yeah, Stalin said that.
I'm pretty
sure. So the two central myths about the Soviet Gulag system are as follows. The first is that they were death camps similar to those of Nazi Germany, or alternatively that their purpose was purely a cynical form of labor extraction. Both of these sentiments have largely been debunked by recent scholarship. With that said, this isn't, of course, to say that the system was not subject to abuses of all kinds, higher death rates than general population, corruption, bureaucratic manipulation, etc., because that is in fact what this system was. But the point of addressing this particular critique is that the popular liberal assumption that these camps are meant for the sole purpose of human destruction is just flat out wrong. And you hear types such as Jordan Peterson and other really arch conservatives really use the Gulag as kind of the center of their critique of the Soviet system, that this is the worst system essentially that ever existed. So what was the Gulag? The Gulag is an acronym actually for the Russian phrase, the main directorate of correctional labor camps. And so within the Soviet Union, correctional labor camps is typically what they're actually called rather than Gulag. The term itself was popularized by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famed author, or rather infamous author, of the Gulag Archipelago. A man whose credibility is, let's put it lightly, in question. What I'd recommend people do is check out the video by Hakim titled "The Man Who Brought Down the Soviet Union Was a Terrible Human Being." Pretty straightforward title, which I guess that's all you need to know. But I recommend watching that video. It really breaks down the problem with Solzhenitsyn himself and his work. But back to the camps themselves. An important thing to know about the Gulag is that often the way it's presented is very kind of flat. The reality is that the nature of these camps was actually quite varied and comprised of the following. So the first are prisons, pretty much like regular jails, where people have cells, etc. And these are people put here for both political crimes as well as everyday criminality. The second, type of Gulag that existed were labor camps. I think this is what people generally picture when they think of the Gulag. People, either mining or doing forestry, doing agriculture, with a pickaxe, breaking rocks. That's kind of what people imagine labor camps to be, which isn't too far from what they were. The other is labor colonies. And so these were essentially labor camps, except they were out in the periphery where people hadn't been living. So these colonies were set to essentially transform the environment to make it hospitable and to make it a place for resource extraction. And one aspect of the Gulag that often gets left out are the special settlements. So these were where in earlier narratives of the series, we talked about, dekulakization, the kulaks either being put on collective farms or in many cases sent to these special settlements, which were just like the labor colonies, kind of out in the boonies, very far off regions that were, to put it bluntly, inhospitable in many ways. And they were tasked with making these places hospitable. And what's interesting about these special settlements is that they weren't like the other colonies or the camps or the prisons, because they essentially function as villages, right? These were communities that were created that included whole families of former kulaks or dekulakized families who were sent out to these areas to transform the land there. And the last element of the gulags were called shurashka. And this is probably the cushiest form of the gulag. This is where if I had to be put into a gulag, it'd probably be the shurashka. And this is where scientists and specialists were housed to do work for the state, essentially innovating technologies for state purposes. There were a parallel system to the gulags was the POW system that emerged during World War II. We're not going to really talk about that, but that system was modeled pretty closely to the gulag system, but it was separate and had different administrators, different rules, etc. So let's talk about numbers. How many people went through the gulag system? Of course, before the archival revolution in the 1990s, the numbers that were out there were like quite varied in how many people went to the gulag, how many people perhaps died in the gulag. But as of 2025, here are the most legitimate, actually based on archival information stats. So it's estimated that between 1930 until 1955, there are 25 million people who went in and out of that system. 18 million of those people were in the prisons or the labor camps or those colonies, and about 7 million were in those special settlements, which I talked about, which were essentially villages rather than kind of like, barbed wired areas or colonies or camps. And at its height, that's 25 million people who went through the system, and the highest amount of people who were actually in the gulag at any given point was about 3 million people. That's during the height of it in the early 50s, which is quite hilarious because if you look back in 1947, there was a book written called Forced Labor in Soviet Russia. And this text was essentially kind of like during the Cold War, before the 1990s, is really a key text. This book, Forced Labor in Russia, what it stated was that at the peak of people who are currently in the system, imprisoned in it, they suggested somewhere between 10 million and 20 million people. Based on archival research we have now, the maximum it ever reached was 3 million. So it's just, testament to the fact that during the Cold War, numbers about anything regarding the Soviet Union were often vastly exaggerated, often by former prisoners themselves or just people making shit up.
Was that because they really needed the Soviet Union to look worse than the United States and its fucking prison system?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say because you think about in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the U.S. mass incarceration system hadn't really picked up. What they were trying to, I think, maybe overshadow was the vastly more expansive system of forced labor, someone called slavery, in the colonized parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa, in South America. But I'll get to that in a second.
Gotcha.
So we have 25 million people who've gone through the system over the 25 years of its existence. What was the mortality rate like, right? How many people died going through the system? If the Gulag itself is analogous to the Nazi death camps, their extermination camps, then we should be seeing a mortality rate that's incredibly high, right? And so based on the latest information, archival information, it is assumed that, and this is combining the numbers for people who died in the camps as well as special settlements, to be about 3.7 million people. That, of course, is a lot of people. And as I've mentioned already, this Gulag system was not perfect. It was subject to a ton of abuses, shortages of food, and other resources for people to kind of live the best they could in these situations. And so that gives a mortality rate of about 10 to 15%, again, based on the specific estimates. So kind of the key idea here is, despite the Gulag not, of course, being the best situation or place to live, the vast majority of the people who went through that system came out on the other end. This is very different to the Nazi concentration camps, which I actually pulled up the numbers for those as well. And what we see is, out of the 2.3 million people who went through the Nazi concentration camps, and this isn't including the extermination camps, these are the concentration camps where labor was generally carried out. About 2.3 million people went through that system, and 1.7 million of them died. So
Holy
that were
shit.
killed as a process. So that's a 75% mortality rate. Okay, we're talking about two vastly different systems of, let's call it concentration, however, or forced labor, however you want to put it. The Nazi labor camps were meant for the purpose of human destruction. The Soviet camps were not. So, what were the Soviet camps for then? What was the purpose of them? Following the revolution, of course, building a new social society, it was very important to the Bolsheviks to really put forth the idea that criminality was created by people's material conditions and not by some kind of inherent value that they could not change about themselves. And so, as part of determining what their system of, we'll call it incarceration, would look like going forward, they knew that reformation was going to be a key aspect of that, or rehabilitation. Is that if we were going to put people in these places to serve sentences for crimes that they've committed, whether that's everyday crime or whether that's even political crimes, that like every Soviet citizen, they are kind of on this journey of becoming a new Soviet person, a reforged person. And so the idea is encapsulated in the Russian word perekovka. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it means reforging. And this was the idea that was really impressed upon in every Gulag system, which all of them had a department specifically for cultural education. And that meant whether that's, ensuring that people in the camps had stuff to do, books to read, activities to do together, to become educated, etc. Part of that education was this reforging process in educating people about socialism and what it means to be part of Soviet society. And as you can imagine, the same can't be said for the Nazi system of labor concentration camps, which weren't particularly interested in educating or improving the lives or kind of the social cohesion of the people who were placed in these camps. So kind of going back here a second to, I talked about the mortality rate in the Soviet Gulag system, which is somewhere between 10 and 15%, as opposed to 75% in the Nazi death camps. So that number is quite high, sucks, but there's a little bit of nuance that's required to understand why that number is so high. At least half of those deaths of people that occurred during the Gulag occurred during World War II. So between the years 1941 and 1945. And so this has to do with, as we've covered on the show, the World War II was incredibly destructive to Soviet society. Roughly 27, 28 million people were killed as a result, land destroyed, systems uprooted, factories annihilated, right? This had an extreme impact on the Soviet system as it existed. And unsurprisingly, this had a negative impact on the Gulag system as well. And so I just want to make one point here, reading a quote from a historian. Unfortunately, I don't have the person's name, but whatever. And they indicated that during the war, the USSR did not have enough food to feed both its military and its civilians, even with the arrival of Lend-Lease and food aid. The state therefore had to engage in a grim calculus and decide how it can most efficiently use its limited resources, that is, how many calories and grams of protein it could allocate to different groups. So in these circumstances, it was inevitable that some people would not obtain enough to eat and many would die. And this is the key point of this quote, which goes on to say, no matter what regime had been in power in the USSR, Stalinist, Trotskyist, Menshevik, or capitalist, it would have faced the same set of choices. And so essentially, this was a problem that the Soviet Union could not avoid. They did not have an infinite amount of resources, which meant that resources that were going towards the Gulag were not enough to ensure that people were able to survive the harsh conditions that were imposed on them by the Nazi invasion. Okay, so I'm just going to share some examples of what life was like in the Gulag. I think what everyone is already aware of, or you can easily look up online, the worst horror stories of what it was like living in these variated camps, right? It's go to YouTube, type in Gulag, have fun, watch all the videos there. But I'm going to share some experiences of what it was like that perhaps you won't find when you go onto YouTube. And these are from direct primary sources or people who are scholars who studied the Gulag in depth. So this first time I'm going to read is actually going to be one of our favorite anti-communists on the show. Her name is Anne Applebaum. She famously wrote a book called Gulag, A History. And interestingly enough, she recounts this experience of a penal colony So kind of like those labor colonies that were kind of far out in the middle of nowhere in the early 1930s. And so this one is called Vorkuta. So writing about Vorkuta, she states that needing hospitals, camp administrators built them and introduced systems for training prisoner pharmacists and prisoner nurses. Needing food, they constructed their own collective farms, their own warehouses, and their own distribution systems. Needing electricity, they built power plants. Needing building materials, they built brick factories. Needing educated workers, they trained the ones that they had. Much of the ex-Gulag workforce turned out to be illiterate or semi-literate, which caused enormous problems when dealing with projects relative technical sophistication. The camp's administration therefore set up technical training schools, which required in turn more new buildings and new cadres, math and physics teachers as well as political instructors to oversee the work. By the 1940s, Vorkuta, which was a city that, as mentioned, started as a gulag, a city built in the permafrost where roads had to be resurfaced and pipes had to be repaired every year, had acquired a geological institute, a university, theaters, puppet theaters, swimming pools, and nurseries. Try finding that one on YouTube.
Based. It's the kind of jail I want to go to.
Where can I apply to be a gulag puppet master? Is that
So one aspect of the gulag.
is it application only, or is it like luck of the draw?
So what's funny is that I only like read about this in passing, but Anne-Louise Strong, always kind of like the number one Soviet advocate in the world. At one point, she writes about the gulags, and she was like, some people, actually applied to be admitted to them. How accurate that is, I'm not too sure, but she may have just been glazing the gulag system, but yeah. So it was varied system, as I mentioned, and as part of the variations that existed in the system, it meant that people weren't always necessarily confined to the area which was a quote-unquote prison or the gulag itself. And so this led to some interesting happenings when prisoners would leave these areas that were often not guarded, and they were allowed to do so and enter into society around them. So this was from a 1935 report from a gulag in Dimitlag, and one of the camp administrators bemoaned the fact that unescorted prisoners used a lunch break to wander around town, to go to town bathhouses, to make various purchases under the pretense of partaking in medical treatment or social activity in the departments of the administration of the construction in the camp. And another report, this is in 1952 in Western Siberia, again, administrators were slightly annoyed that certain prisoners were taking advantage of this kind of freedom that existed, where they were visiting population centers and drinking and associating with citizens outside of the camp. And this final story I'll relate to you is interesting because it comes from, again, one of these penal colonies out in the middle of nowhere. And this is a recounting from a woman called Stefaniska, who, strangely enough, had interesting or positive feelings about her experience in the Gulag. And there she wrote that we forgot that we were prisoners and that before us was a long term. This was all the particularity of Grand Karlach, which is the name of the region that their Gulag was situated in. It is very big. Its territory is huge. And in the middle of Karlach is the convoy zone, a strict regime. So this was the area where the worst criminals or counter-revolutionaries were kept, and these people often were guarded for the entirety of their stay there. And there, everyone is under strict supervision and a convoy. But the rest of the prisoners, those under the general regime, live without the convoy or the strictness. The camp is agricultural, and the unconvoyed mass of prisoners was occupied in agriculture, animal husbandry, and sheep herding. And so all this goes to say that the Gulag system was not a system of human destruction, as seen in the Nazi concentration camps. And, if someone were to, you're online, you're out with some comrades, whatever the case is, and someone's speaking bad about the Gulag, talking about this abuse or that abuse, etc. Woody in that meme where he's like, hold up, let them cook. You can do that. You can let them cook up until a certain point, right? When you need to step in is when they start comparing the gulags to the Nazi concentration camps, right? Because that could be construed or understood as a form of Holocaust denial by kind of reducing the severity of the Nazi genocide down to the level of, people walking out of the gulag and like getting drunk and then coming back at night to like break rocks the next morning, right? Kind of like, I break rocks in the morning too, right? Those kind of like that. Alternatively, what is being done when people try to make an analogy between the Gulag and Nazi concentration camps is that this leaves out a very key aspect of forced labor, which no one fucking talks about, which is the forced labor that existed, as I mentioned earlier, in the colonized world, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, much more extensive systems of forced labor that existed. One anti-communist actually, who's like, yeah, the Gulag system is the fucking worst. What he described the situation in Africa being was that every country in Africa was itself its own Gulag, its own camp. With that said,
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up. Any jail's
Can't-
going to suck, right?
can't live with them, can't live without them.
Yeah.
Nobody in these fucking colonies or Nazi camps were getting paid fucking prevailing wages, y'all. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even remotely comparable. Right. And like,
life as working class in the United States of America is considerably worse than the lives of these folks in the Gulag.
Mortality rate's probably higher too.
Spicy. One thing I will say is that one thing about the Gulag is that 25 million people went through it over that 25-year period, but every year roughly between 20 to 40% of people were released from the Gulag, right? So it's like certain scholars have called it almost a revolving door, in the sense that it's like people aren't there for long and their terms or their stays there aren't as long as one would imagine if they watched a YouTube Gulag documentary. Oh yeah, one thing, I guess last thing I'll note is that I read an interesting book about this in regards to the Gulag's function during the Great Patriotic War or World War II. They played a significant role in ensuring Soviet victory. Many of those people who were interned to get reduced stays there volunteered to be part of the Red Army, going to the front often. So we had many people who were mobilized in a variety of ways to help the war effort, who did so, understanding what it meant for them to protect the socialist system as it existed. Many of them, after the war, receiving a variety of commendations for their activities. The Shroskas, which I mentioned, which house scientists and a whole host of different kind of people studying agriculture, for example, whatever the case may be, many of them secured reduced stays following the war due to their contributions to the war effort. It's often an aspect which gets left out. It was left out during Soviet retellings of this stuff. And even today in Russia, it's kind of an aspect that's minimized because, Gulag bad, right? But let's not forget that the success of the Soviets in the Great Patriotic War was a collective effort. Everyone contributed to ensure the survival of the USSR. Mic drop.
Okay, well then I won't say anything.
Pick this mic up. We can't afford to be dropping
I'm going to go
mics.
back to meditate now, guys.
No, I was just going to say, just kind of like the abortion thing, kind of like a number of other critiques of the Soviet Union. You cannot compare apples and oranges. The Gulag system was not designed as a way to make people as miserable as possible. They constantly were thinking about how to improve the conditions of the people in these systems, constantly. It was a conscious thought. It wasn't just like let's throw them in this fucking concrete, tiny concrete room for years on end, like it is in the U.S. So sure, jail sucks, but what are you gonna do?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good point.
I've been thinking a lot about. Oh, sorry. I was gonna go totally other. I'm wild today, you guys. I'm not right.
Okay, I'll finish what I was gonna say then.
Okay.
So, of course, the shortcomings of the Soviet system, that as a result of its material conditions, the expanse, the vastness of the country, the lack of the technological progress as it was in the 1930s, right? Sometimes had people, sometimes the local Communist Party official just had a bike to get around, like the area the size of France is the example Samantha Lam uses, right? So it's that caused, of course, problems within the system, but also what was causing problems in the Gulag system was the bureaucracy, right? And the differing, whether clans or competing priorities that made parts of the system dysfunctional, and that impacted the Gulag as well. The work that they were doing was for the betterment of Soviet society, whether it was again, creating infrastructure, creating these places for the Soviet society to expand into, versus forced labor in the colonial context, or whether that's Africa, somewhere Nigeria where I'm from, or India, wherever, these people are building railroads or whatever the case may be, ports that aren't for their use, right? They're not building these
Yeah.
things for the betterment of their community. It's for the betterment of the imperial project. Yeah.
The working class differs from the bourgeoisie, among other things, in that it is not a wealthy class, that it was not able to formerly train in its sons the knowledge and faculty of government. It has become able to do so only now, after coming to power. That, incidentally, is the reason why the question of cultural revolution is so acute with us. True, in the 10 years of its rule, the working class of the USSR has accomplished far more in this respect than the landlords and capitalists did in hundreds of years. But the international and internal situation is such that the results achieved are far from sufficient. Therefore, every means capable of facilitating the development of the working class of the faculty and ability to administer the country and industry. Every such means must be utilized by us to the full, but it follows from what has been said that the slogan of self-criticism is one of the most important means of developing the cultural powers of the proletariat, of developing the faculty of government in the working class.
So this one is going to be probably a bit more open-ended than the other criticisms we've addressed, but we covered it, I think, in a decent amount of detail in part 3. And so the issue we want to address here is that Stalin, at least as I perceive it, I think others on the Prolespod team perceive it as well, that Stalin destroyed the class struggle in the 1930s, particularly in the mid-1930s. An example of this is during the implementation and the rollout of the 1936 Soviet Constitution. One of its key elements was universal suffrage, which sounds great, but what it did introduce was the people known as the Lashensi. These were people who were part of the former oppressing classes, whether they're religious leaders or they're capitalists or kulaks, whatever the case may be. These people were deprived of voting rights and really participation rights in many aspects of Soviet society. And so as part of the new constitution, Stalin was like, he suggested this specifically. He's like, we're removing those restrictions on them because...
And a lot of the Bolsheviks disagreed, right? They were like, no, it's too soon. And he was like, shut up, they're cool.
Yeah, exactly. His argument basically was that Soviet society had transformed so much in the 15 or 16 years in its existence that the oppressing classes had been smashed, had been defeated, that they really weren't a threat anymore. And this is 2 years after Kirillov's death. Like, I'm still confused as to why he thought that, because as Ray mentioned, not only were party officials like, what, but people, in the rural areas particularly, were not happy with this change because they understood that these people, these former kulaks, former capitalists, whatever, religious leaders, whatever they were going to worm themselves back into the Soviet system and to do things in an anti-Soviet way to destroy the system. And we see that actually being reported on that local level in 1937, in 1938, when those elections are coming up. Again, we'll recommend Samantha Lom's book on the Soviet Constitution. She details specific quotes from people at this local level being like, what the hell? This is a problem. And so the question is, why did Stalin think that the oppressing classes had been smashed when that clearly wasn't the case?
So we've talked about this more than once, but he was a workaholic, right? He slept very little and he worked from sun up to sundown and beyond, sometimes literally sleeping.
He was just too tired. He was
4
like, just let them vote. I'm so sleepy.
But he did make time to meet with and talk with average, normal ass people. And in fact, there are pictures and paintings of him meeting with peasants and working class people in conferences of large groups where they would come and bring grievances to the Central Committee or the Supreme Soviet. These sorts of things were happening, but he was not going to the countryside, right? Like he was too busy to go to the countryside, and so perhaps
he was also terrified of planes and only got on a plane twice to go to Potsdam. That was it.
Yeah.
Clearly, he's a fucking prophet. Look at planes now.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe he just was, maybe he needed a little Xi Jinping, go out to the villages, go out to the countryside kind of thing. But again, I don't know if he had the time, and that's really sort of what I'm trying to get at.
I think that there was a part of him that did know, and he just rushed it. But I don't want to get into it because it's going to be a part of my final contradiction section.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was just cope, honestly. He was so tired, and he was ready to be like, he's like, I just need to hand this off. I need this to be like a thing that I don't need to stand and look at all the time. We just need to move away from the structure we have now. And he was hoping that that's what was going to happen. I don't know.
So keeping in mind the end of the first 5-year plan, he said that, we were dizzy with success. Yeah. So I think Stalin, probably by 1936, 1937, was dizzy as fuck. And perhaps on this singular point, misread the class struggle. But anyways, getting to back to more concrete matters.
There is only one conclusion, that without self-criticism, there can be no proper education of the party, the class, and the masses. And that without proper education of the party, the class, and the masses, there can be no Bolshevism. Why has the slogan of self-criticism acquired special importance just now, at this particular moment of history, in 1928? Because the growing acuteness of class relations, both in the internal and external spheres, is more glaringly evident now than it was a year or two ago. Because the subversive activities of the class enemies of the Soviet government, who are utilizing our weaknesses, our errors against the working class of our country, are more glaringly evident now than they were a year or two ago. Because we cannot and must not allow the lessons of the Shakti affair and the procurement maneuvers of the capitalist elements in the countryside, coupled with our mistakes in planning, to go unheeded. If we want to strengthen the revolution and meet our enemies fully prepared, we must rid ourselves as quickly as possible of our errors and weaknesses, as disclosed by the Shakti affair and the grain procurement difficulties. If we do not want to be caught unawares by all sorts of surprises and accidents to the joy of the enemies of the working class, we must disclose as quickly as possible those weaknesses and errors of ours, which have not yet been disclosed, but which undoubtedly exist. Okay, so we're just going to take a quick detour. Listen, I know that when earlier we were speaking about abortion, I tried to think through this and think like what could have been a solution? What was another way? For this one, I don't really have an answer. I just have a grievance. And Stalin says, it's okay to air a grievance, even when you don't have perfect analysis. So I'm going to listen to his advice. I'm going to tell you, listen, that man was in his 70s when he died. As we know, smoker, drinker, working a gajillion hours a day. Death comes for us all. We know he tried to step down. They wouldn't let him. But when Lenin died, there was an absolute clusterfuck of a kerfuffle for the succession. And I understand in that moment, Lenin did not want to lead the party. He knew that whatever he said, people would listen. Even the things that he didn't say in the self-same letter where he said that Stalin was rude, he didn't even give any meaningful answer of what he thought needed to happen. And you see like every faction of socialist and Soviet forever henceforth has like made their opinions about what he did or didn't say, right? And so we see this like a giant kerfuffle. We see the gaping hole in the leadership, the sort of vacuum, and like all of the tensions that arose out of that. And like Stalin, I'm sorry, is like giving Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Like, he should have done something about that. And like, when Lenin died, I mean, we got all, like, I want to be like, well, we lucked out because we got Stalin, but at the same time, we got all the wreckerism that still persists today as a result of nobody saying anything. And then obviously when Stalin died, we were not so lucky the second time. So like, I am upset about this. Discuss.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe he just thought it shouldn't be up to him like Lenin did as well. Like
Probably.
that he just
That sounds
I'm
like
sure he
Stalin.
thought that. I'm sure he thought that. And that's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that this is Stalin's mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The one.
I mean, and part of it, like a lot of
No, if you guys want to stick around for secret speech, I'm going to tell you a criticism I have not yet even shared with my co-hosts yet.
God.
So if you want the hottest tea, you better stick around.
Yeah, I don't know. It just feels like and you know, and it may have been a mistake, but I think it just was him that he just was like, it's not my business to tell other people how they should decide who replaces me when I go. It's the failure on the part of the party to have a program in place to train people up for leadership at the highest levels. Like, you know, again, this is back to Xi Jinping. Like, there is a program in place to send people out into the countryside to learn what it's like to deal with the problems, not in the center, not in Beijing, not in Shanghai, but out in the countryside, out where the working people are. Then they can ascend to the higher levels. But that is a process that probably should have been developed in the Soviet Union earlier, not necessarily identical to that, but one in which people who achieve, you know, these higher ranked positions have a certain type of education that prepares them for that leadership.
Kind of like the
Right.
Komsomol, but for
Leadership.
like
Exactly.
politicians.
Yeah. A strict distinction must be drawn between this self-criticism, which is alien to us, and destructive and anti-Bolshevik, and our Bolshevik self-criticism, the object of which is to promote the party spirit, to consolidate the Soviet regime, to improve our constructive work, to strengthen our economic cadres, to arm the working class.
All right. And I think the last thing that we're going to talk about today is something that I have held kind of close to the chest since it came to me while suffering insomnia one night, which I stayed up almost the entire night thinking about this one topic. Then I wrote down a bunch of notes in my phone so that I wouldn't forget. And then my phone broke and they weren't backed up to the cloud. And so I don't have those notes anymore.
Which right there is the argument for why the Bolsheviks had so much paperwork. You see, that wouldn't have happened
the
with their
bureaucracy
system.
would have saved us. Yeah. I think if we're honest with ourselves, this is something that we're probably all aware of peripherally, but I don't think has been addressed as a contradiction itself. It's talked about a lot, but not in this context. In order to achieve anything approaching socialism across the board, thus allowing us to move into a phase at which we can create a stable culture within itself, we have to get everyone on board, or at least a vast majority. Otherwise, we open ourselves to counter-revolutionary sabotage. There are three main ways in which nations or movements have chosen to accomplish this, at least in my estimation. One was Stalin, who was the first, right? He was the first one that had to lead a nation into socialism. You could say Lenin, but that I don't think it counts, honestly. For him, this looked like creating and speaking to the specific needs of the workers and the peasants themselves, giving them a large amount of democratic freedom, kind of like we just talked about. It looked like giving voice to them by targeting class enemies and purging them from the party, or in the case of criminal class enemies, jailing and eventually executing those with the most serious violations. While this appealed to and protected those already dedicated to the cause of the party, socialism and Marxism-Leninism, it worried and alienated a large chunk of the general quote-unquote apolitical masses. Further, it frustrated the intelligentsia as a whole and those descended from money, as they were the most likely to become counter-revolutionary, feeling wronged by the equalizing effects of the system that was put in place under Stalin's government. This opened a large door, for hostile foreign and domestic members of the USSR, which meant more liquidation. Eventually, as a result of the largely negative response to the purges and trials, the NKVD moved its focus from public, open, more democratic-minded suppression to a highly intricate and clandestine surveillance system that lasted for the rest of the USSR. The contradiction was never solved. 2. After Stalin died and Khrushchev executed his coup a few years later, the right wing was firmly in charge. I, will give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he was not actually interested in destroying socialism as he saw it in the USSR. And I do actually think that that's true. Therefore, his moves only make sense in the context of his interpretation of the way to address the contradiction. I'll take the liberty of interpreting his intentions and say that he felt that the best way to avoid the influential intelligentsia and co. working hard to create a counter-revolution by appealing to them. This was done by demonizing Stalin, who was their boogeyman, right? The intelligentsia, the privileged people, they looked at Stalin as this monster, right, throughout the entire history. He opened the jails, or the gulags, and he created a focus on monocropping, which created massive trade prospects, and he used the planned economy to work toward consumer goods. This created luxuries and items that had a placating effect on the population at large, but especially those in the privileged classes. It did the job. There were no longer constant and major counter-revolutionary efforts from anything resembling a true movement backed by anyone popular. As we are all aware, this did not solve the contradiction either. It had the dual effect of, one, creating a focus on socialism as an alternative to capitalism, not from the perspective of a movement towards communism, but as an economic system that could provide consumer goods at the same pace as capitalism could, which was, of course, impossible. It also meant that those in the traditionally privileged classes were empowered even more, eventually leading to stagnation and Gorbachev's eventual dismantling of socialism. The last strategy to address this contradiction, in my opinion, was initiated by those leading China after Mao's death. This focused on creating productive forces, allowing capitalist investment and production to continue while remaining under the guiding hand of the party itself. This in turn made them not as threatening to the Western powers and meant a quick and massive increase in living standards similar to what Khrushchev did with consumer goods, without empowering those folks in a way that could undermine the party itself. We cannot say with certainty that this will not work, but we can guess based on science. It is the long game. And I think given enough time, it could succeed. More and more people, both in and out of the country, buy in every day. The party's been working, at least under Xi, towards slow disintegration of capitalist powers, which they do easily because of the people's faith in the system as a result of the measures that they've put forward. It has provided well for the people. But we don't have time. Climate catastrophe needs to be solved quickly, and capitalism can't do it. We don't have time for China to slowly turn to full-fledged public sector. Even if they somehow pulled it off, they have no capacity to spread it to the rest of the world, as they've maintained a strict neutrality with regards to it, letting those countries choose their own path. We also don't know if the final abolition of private property would initiate a counter-revolution or not. It very well could, regardless. And this, I believe, is the final contradiction. And even if we take the capitalists at their word that socialism, as a result of this contradiction, looks good on paper but doesn't work in practice, we are still left with the undeniable fact that climate catastrophe will destroy us if we do not move towards socialism. So this is a contradiction that we need to solve in order to successfully reach global revolution. And I believe that whoever solves this contradiction will be the next person after Lenin/Stalin to truly evolve Marxism-Leninism to its next and hopefully final step. And no, while I think they made very major contributions, even refinements to Marxism, I do not think that Mao or Hoxha or any of the people that we tack on to the end of Marxism-Leninism evolved Marxism to any unique universal scientific applications. And this I see as the final contradiction of socialism.
Wait, is this show political?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know. I've got no answers for that one, to be honest, because it is a contradiction, and it's a major one that, like, you are going to inspire counter-revolution. You are going to do it. It's going to happen, but how do you know, because you can't murder everyone, right? Like, you can't just kill
Right. Yeah.
kill everyone.
That's what I mean. There's got to be some way out.
And you can try re-education, which, you know, the Soviet Union did, but it's never 100% effective.
There has to be another axis.
Pol Pot figured it out.
You just kill everybody in the cities.
Thank you to our patrons. Please head to patreon.com/Prolespod. Jesus fucking Christ.
Yeah.
Solidarity forever.
Yeah. all of us wear glasses, so none of us would make it in the Pol Pot revolution.
That's not true. The people's husband has had LASIK.
Oh shit.
So.
Okay. He'll make it.
As long as I get enough boxes of contacts before the revolution happens, I should be all right.
Oh Jesus. Wow.
Okay.
That's a downer to end on.
I have thoughts, but I feel like we should take this. I think we should take this somewhere more private, like
the backstage,
like the Stalin Eras backstage pass.
Yeah.
For Patreon subscribers. That about does it for this episode. Thank you to all of our Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are Sabina, Sean M, Doc Quantum, Simon S, Matt G, Jake the Snake Bakes a Cake by the Lake, Isa, Bryson P, Andrew A, Jonathan H, Santiago P, Rix Y, Nate P, Swedish Tanky, Hannes P, and Lagging Behind the Revolution. And a very special shout out to our Vanguard patrons, Lil Lumpin' Prol, Better Red Than Liberal, The Winking Cossack, Talking Socks, and Comrade Chihuahua. Once again, if you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/Prolespod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all the algorithm stuff, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
Bye.
Death to America.
Death to America.
Bing.
The mighty man, and the mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.